If you're in charge of training and recruiting new sound techs, sometimes musicians can be the best mixers that end up being on your team, even if they're not all that technical. Musicians have a big advantage when it comes to mixing and running sound. They know what it should sound like because they've spent hours and hours doing critical listening for parts and arrangements, and knowing how the pieces all fit together. The problem is trying to train them on the soundboard without them getting overwhelmed. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you're new here, my name is James and I help church sound techs, worship leaders, and tech directors eliminate the mystery and frustration around sound at church. If that's you, you've found the right place, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button. The first thing that I do with any sound tech that I'm training is listening critically to music together. Listen to a track that's got an arrangement somewhat similar to what you're going to be playing there at church. I mean, I love Snarky Puppy, but that doesn't help so much for our worship band. While listening to this track, listen to different instruments and see how they sound and how all the pieces fit together in the mix. Talk about the relationship of the levels between different instruments, because they've probably already identified the different instruments that are in the mix. You can use words like tucked back behind or out in front. This helps people understand that not everything is front and center in a mix, and there can be things that play a supporting role but still play a role in the mix. The next thing that you want to do is get them some quick wins with balancing the faders. If they're a creative person, they're probably more driven by fun than doing things right. So if you can set up the soundboard so that the things are working and then hand over control to them to do the creative parts that they're already good at, they're going to get a quick win under their belt and they're going to experience some of the joy of running sound. And that's one of my favorite joys in life, so hopefully you can share that with them. We don't want to bog them down with too much technical discussion at first. We really want them to feel like they can do a great job before we start showing them all the different technical things that can help them do a better job. When we talk about gain structure, that's the places where we're turning it up and turning it down on the soundboard, and there's more than one spot where we do that. The two main ones that we use are the preamp, or the gain, and the fader. And the fader should be used for fine-tuning adjustments, mostly, and the gain should be able to get our level up to a good usable level. The gain also affects everywhere else that signal goes, while the fader just affects the main mix and some other effects sends and things like that, but don't get into the details with them quite yet. Really keep it simple. If they're balancing the mix on the faders and they notice that a fader has to get pushed way up, maybe +5 or so before it's at the right level, teach them that that's a sign that your preamp is set too low. If they need to adjust the preamp while the band is playing, they need to make sure that they give them a heads up. So it's best to wait till between songs and get in the talkback mic or just run up there on stage if you have to and say, hey, I've got to adjust the preamp on this, so it's going to affect your monitor mixes. I've got to make that change, so I'm going to have that instrument play for just a minute, and you guys can make the adjustment on your mixer as well. Then you can make the adjustment on your preamp and pull your fader down till it's at a more usable level. On the flip side, sometimes the fader's down at -20 and it's almost too loud down there. That means that our preamp is too high for what it needs to be in our mix. So we might need to pull the preamp down some. Now that's not going to be as damaging as if we crank up the preamp for people who are playing on stage, but we still want to give them the heads up, so it's best to do that in between songs. Once they've established that relationship between the preamp gets changed when I need a different fader position to get my balance right, then you can start to introduce things like looking at the meters and using the meters to be kind of a gauge of how much gain you need for a particular input. My rule of thumb is that just touching on the yellow is probably a good thing. So that's a great starting place and a place where they can aim to set that, unless they've got it intuitively a little bit better anyway. When you're ready to take the next step and teach them more things about gain structure and the preamp, one thing that you can mention to them, especially if they've played on your worship team, is if you're on the worship team and you're mixing your monitors, and say you have a personal monitor mixer, and there's stuff that you have to turn way up to get balanced, at the same time where something is turned up just a little bit and it's screaming loud, that's a problem with gain structure or where the preamp is set. You don't have to talk to them about the meters so much at first, other than just keeping it out of the red, but Tell them that in order to get things balanced well for you at the soundboard and for everybody else on stage, getting your preamp set so that your faders sound balanced while they're somewhere in the range of 0 to -10 is going to make it easy for everybody to get enough level wherever they need it. If they're good at hearing the arrangement, how all the pieces fit together, but they're still struggling to balance the mix on the faders, walk them through this system for how to build their mix from the ground up. Start with all the faders down, if you can. I understand some worship leaders want to hear the house while they're rehearsing, so that can be a problem, but try it anyway. Pull all the faders down and start with just the worship leader's instrument or the primary instrument and the lead vocal. From there, add the bass to fill in the bottom end of the primary instrument. And then you can link that to the kick drum. When you turn up the kick drum so that the kick drum is the punch and the bass guitar is the sustain, now you can match the snare drum to the kick, you can match the toms to the snare drum, and you can mix in a little bit of overheads. If the toms aren't playing, don't just sit around waiting for them. Sometimes there's no toms for a long time. Sometimes the song is all toms. You just have to wait for the right opportunity. But tell them that's where you need to match that level. Next, you can start to fill in your other instruments. So your other mid-range instruments, like your guitars and keyboards that aren't the primary instrument, those you fill in to fill in the gaps without covering up the lead vocal or the primary instrument. One way that I teach people to do this is with bracketing. Bracketing, you turn it up till you can just barely hear it, and then you turn it up till it's too loud, and you know that's probably the zone in between those two spots where it's going to sound good. The other thing to try is to turn it up until you can hear it above the primary instrument, and then tuck it back so that it sits a little bit behind the primary instrument. This keeps you from ratcheting or turning it up and up and up and up, one thing and then another thing and then another thing. It gets kind of out of control if you go with that method and aren't aware that that can be happening to you. Finally, I mix in the background vocals last. After they've had time to warm up and really find their voice and find their part, that's when I'll start to mix those in. So here's how we start a mix from scratch. In this song, the primary instrument is the keyboard. There are other instruments that are doing fun things, but I like the keyboard. It's got the piano and the pad in it. So we're gonna pull this up, and here is the lead singer too. Now you're also gonna have to understand the feeling and the SPL in your room. So you can't hear that in my room, I can't hear that in your room, and this is a video, so you're probably watching on a phone, but we're gonna turn up the piano first. And he stopped playing a little bit. So now we're gonna turn up the lead vocal.
You stand alone, you stand alone, in glory and majesty, you stand alone, in glory.
Now we're gonna turn up the bass.
Stand alone, in glory and majesty, you stand
And again, you'll have to use the feel of your system to know how loud this bass should be. Now we have the kick drum. Maybe a little more bass. Now we can add the snare. All the rest of the instruments dropped out. But now it's a good time to mix in the toms too, as long as they're there. This normally doesn't happen during sound check. We can also add in the overheads. Remember, we don't need a ton of these. He's not actually playing the cymbals right now, so let's wait for that. Aha, there's a crash. That feels about right. We do have the drum pads here as well. I'm going to go ahead and pull these up some. We'll fine tune it after they hit them. That's what happens with these little instruments that get played rarely. Now we can worry about bringing in our guitars. So we'll listen to each one, figure out what it's doing, and then relate it to the keys and the bass. Seems like it's still in the pocket, so we're happy there. Now let's mix in our other background vocals. You can also mix in the snare bottom. It's not essential, but it's kind of fun. And of course, they stop when we're ready to mix it. All right, so now we've built our mix and we just fine tune from there. As sections change, maybe we emphasize one instrument over another one. As different singers are singing, maybe we push them up or down, depending. If the drums need something different, if they could move to a side stick and we need a little bit more snare to fill that spot, we can push that up and pull it down. You got to remember, this is a moving piece of equipment. It's not set it and forget it. So after you get this basically set up, now you're set up to actually play and highlight different things. Your musical sound techs will probably have an easier time identifying the melody versus the harmony, but it's also important to point out that the melody has to stay out in front, and no matter how much you like the harmony parts, they need to stay tucked back, or at least even and a little bit behind the lead vocal. Now, if they've got these steps right and things are gelling together really well, there are some additional steps that they can take to get things sounding right and sounding good together. So you can start to teach them EQ and how to get more of the tones right so that certain instruments will blend better with other instruments. If your church uses stems or multi-tracks to supplement some of your band's inputs, that can be a great way to listen to individual inputs by themselves that made the recording so that you can understand and get a mental picture of what a great guitar tone sounds like for this mix, or what great bass tone sounds like on your sound system. Not everything translates perfectly between what makes a great recording and what makes a great live mix, but it's going to get you close enough so that you can identify what the critical components are and how each instrument needs to sound in order to fit well in the mix. Once they have that mental picture established, then it's important to teach them how to get the sounds right on stage, both with your mic placement on your drums, tuning and dampening of all of that. That's a huge thing to getting a great sounding mix, in addition to the onboard EQ and settings on the different instruments. Sometimes an acoustic guitar player just has their graphic EQ whatever shape they want it to be, and it's not exactly helping their sound better through the sound system. After they've captured the source right, make sure that they know how to get the high pass filter and low pass filter set right. This can help you take away unwanted rumble and noise out of instruments and voices so that they can sound clearer and you can get an easier time getting everything to gel together. When you don't have the noise from the top end or the unwanted rumble on the bottom end, things get clearer, and the things that need to take up the bottom end are left alone down there to do their job. After they've got a hang of the high pass filter and low pass filter, teach them how to EQ vocals. When you can get vocals sounding right, it gives you a huge boost of confidence, and vocals sounding weird is one of the things that will just bug you all the time when you're mixing. Once they've got vocal EQ and compression under control, the next thing you want to teach them is how to EQ the drums. When you get drum EQ sounding really great, it really gets the energy up, and that's probably what they're craving. Even maybe more than vocal clarity, they want to get that energy and that feeling if they're a creative person that really thrives on that. However, when they're getting started and they're still on the baby steps of getting the balance right and getting gain structure, you should set up these things for them so that they sound good right out of the gate. I recommend having a bass scene that they can recall and get started with, and most of the background things like vocal EQ, drum EQ, all of your routing and effects is already dialed in and up so that it's easy for them to hit a home run. If you don't know how to approach EQ and compression on drums, vocals, and other instruments, and you want a good helping hand to get started or pointed in the right direction, I've got a book called The Live Mixing Field Guide that details my starting places on places where I listen for EQ first. Not necessarily a preset, but a good starting place to say, do I want to adjust this frequency, and does it make it sound better or worse? Including some compression settings that you might start with while you're getting your feet wet and learning how to use these tools. You can find more information at livemixingfieldguide.com, or I'll throw a link down in the description below. My final piece of advice is to let creative people be creative. Give them some space and don't micromanage every decision that they make. If they want to experiment with having this instrument or that instrument be the primary instrument, let them do it. If they've got an idea for getting a certain delay and adding that to the vocal, let them play with it to some extent. You really want to encourage them to be creative and own the mix. They're going to have more fun when they do, and they're going to do a much better job. Sometimes that requires that we let go of a little control. Just make sure that you still put some guardrails on their preferences so they don't make it sound like a metal drum kit if you've got a soft rock band. Hey, I hope these tips have been helpful for you in recruiting worship team members and other musicians to join the sound team. If you like this video, go ahead and mash that thumbs up. Be sure to hit subscribe and don't ding the little bell because you don't need any more notifications in your life. And remember, it's all about the low end. Avoid the sound tech solo and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.